lesson in our class, which is on the book of James. And James is really all about being fully committed to the Lord. And make sure you have your notes out. We're going to start with this letter, this general epistle, talking about the author of the book of James. The letter claims to be from a certain, in Greek, which would be Jacob, and which we then translate that into James. And there's really several Jameses that we know about in the New Testament. The first one is James, the son of Zebedee. He is one of the 12 disciples, one of Jesus' followers. He's one of Jesus' close disciples, because he would be in there with the Peter, James, and John. So that would be that James, and the closeness of the disciples, the one who went off with Jesus, fell asleep when he was in the garden, and in that act. There's James, the son of Alphaeus. He is also one of the 12 disciples. He also is distinguished by being called James the Younger, but he's not one of the close disciples. He's actually listed down lower in the list. There's James, the father of Judas, according to Luke chapter 6 and Acts chapter 1. And then there's James, the Lord's brother, according to Matthew and Acts and Galatians. And so these four James really are understanding of who it is. So let's talk about which of these four Jameses that it might be. Well, one argument is that it is not James, any of those, is that there's really only two references to Jesus in the letter. One at the beginning of chapter 1, one at the beginning of chapter 2. The author seems to betray the scattered heritage by the Jews. And he is very familiar with Greek. There also seems to be a misunderstanding of Paul, which we're going to talk about. And also, early church fathers were late to recognize it as a book to be part of the canon. Now, some have suggested that really this book is what's called pseudepigrapha. We talked about that before. That's written under a false name, and that somebody is attributing James to be the author, which really maybe it's not. Some believe that it was originally anonymous, later added James to it. And maybe it's some other James. I mean, James is a very common name, would have been a very common name in the early first century. Originally, some say that it was a Jewish document with Christian references were then added later on, and maybe it should have been in the Old Testament. Some think the letter is more testimonial and not just a letter to the church. And then some think that letter just then added some material later on to know who it is. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the author in this video because that is some of the debate. And also, one of the discussions that comes out is that even though there are only two references by name to Jesus in the book of Jesus, references to Jesus, there's much more about Christ and what's called Christology in the book. That is an understanding of who Christ is. And so the book is deeply influenced by Jesus' teaching, even though they only mention his name twice. And so if we were sitting in a seated class, we would be reading and comparing these verses. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through these verses here and look at them. And I would encourage you in your own time. I know as a college student you have a lot of free time to do extra stuff, but maybe sometime down the road this might be an interest to some of you. But according to James chapter 1, verse 2, he talks about the joy of testing, and that's relationship to Matthew in the chapter 5 coming out of the Beatitudes and talking about the testing that we go through. James chapter 1 verse 4 and Matthew chapter 5 verse 48 both talk about being called to maturity in our relationship with the Lord. James chapter 1 verse 5 and some other verses there talk about the difference between asking and receiving. If we do not have because we do not ask. James chapter 1 verse 12 talks about the endurance and salvation, also along with Matthew chapter 10. A lot of these verses that we'll compare to the Gospels do come from Matthew, although there are other references, but I primarily pulled them from the book of Matthew. James chapter 1 talks about anger and righteousness. James chapter 1, 22 and 23, and also Matthew chapter 7, 24 and 26 talk about being doers of the word, that we are to do what the word says. The poor will inherit, according to James chapter 2 and also Matthew chapter 3, about the humbleness, the poor in the spirit out of the Beatitudes. We also have James chapter 2, 10 through 12, and Matthew chapter 22 and verses talking about our liberty and our neighbor's love. Merciless is judged in James chapter 2 verse 13 and Matthew 7 1. We have the care for the poor. James talks about also later in the Matthew's gospel, caring for the poor. That we are to care for the fruit of the good works, that we are to do good things in James chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 7. Warning of divided loyalties according to James 4 and Matthew 6. Being pure in heart in Matthew 4:8 and 5:8. James 4:8 and Matthew 5:8. Humility and exaltation according to 4:10 and Matthew 23. The dangers of wealth according to James 5 and Matthew chapter 6. Being an example, looking to the prophets, both Matthew and James talk about those. And then oaths that are forbidden, according to James chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 3. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And then restoring a believer to a right relationship. So what we're going to see here is that even though there are only two references to name of Jesus' name in James's letter, there's really much more in line with Jesus' teachings in James and with the Gospels than just the name. And so those who would say, well, he only mentions his name twice, so therefore it's not really should be accepted, or we doubt that who the author is, really don't understand what the whole book may be about. Because the writer shows that he had been being from the Palestinian region who was a Jew. The author at James chapter 2 verses 14 through 26 does not address Paul, but at best is really kind of a misunderstanding of Paul's teaching. Now, the early church's lack of citation may be more due to the nature of the 2nd and 3rd century, when Christology and the idea of Gnosticism that we learn just through knowledge is rather than a lack of the letter itself. Now, there's also a great similarity between what's called Kiro, which is a greeting in Greek, between James chapter 1 and Acts chapter 15, and that is also found in Acts chapter 23. In Acts chapter 15, verse 17, and James 2:7, the believers are called by God's name, and they are to hear from both, according to James in that. Now, one of the things that we understand is that James and the rest of the New Testament pictures James as a leader in the Jerusalem church. James is seen as a guarantor of Jewish expression of Christianity, and Jesus' view of the laws. I'm going to pause here for a second. I'm going to spell a word out here. The word is collaboration. I spelled that wrong too. Should be an O. If I can cross that out there. There we go. So this is James's view of the law is a collaboration of this picture according to James. So we get down through all of this discussion to understand who the author is. Well, we understand that the author of this book is James, the son of Joseph. He is Jesus' half-brother, Jesus' brother, because the destination of this letter is to those Jews who have been scattered. And we actually have what's called an ossuary. I'm going to show you a picture in just a second of what that is. Showing a description where it says Jesus, the brother of the Lord, James, the brother of the Lord Jesus. And this information points us to that James, the brother of Joseph, was the author. Now, along with that, we're going to talk about the date, that being written around AD 45. And we understand this, that James was converted after the resurrection of the Lord, according to 1 Corinthians. When you see that listed in there, you see that his brothers came to a personal relationship with Jesus after Jesus' resurrection. And James then becomes a prominent leader in the Jerusalem church in Acts chapter 12, that which would have been around AD 41 to 42. Now, James dies approximately around AD 62. It was written before the Jerusalem Council because there's no mention of that, and it's 48 to 49. He also predates Paul's letters, which would have started around 48 to 49. Remember, Galatians being the first one right before the Jerusalem Council, and before the mission to reach out to the Gentiles. And so this letter, written by James, Jesus' half-brother, most likely, if we put all the books of the New Testament in order, chronologically, Paul's first letter would have been Galatians, which were written in 48, 49. So this letter to James would have been written just a little bit before that. Now, he is writing to what is called the dispersion. That is a scattering of the believers from Jerusalem that had left because of persecution, not necessarily from Paul, okay, but from other things going on in Jerusalem. And so he's writing to Jewish Christians outside of Palestine. There was a precedent for such a letter going all the way back to the Old Testament in Jeremiah, also into the New Testament in Acts. The middle reference is what's called Second Maccabees, which is an apocryphal letter, which is not in the Bible, but still understanding of the Word. And the best understanding is because of the way that the word dysphoria right here in Greek is used. Now, he was writing to comfort those believers and that he would commend them to be pure in their religion. He wanted them to be not only professors, but he wanted them to be doers of the word. Not just to say, hey, I'm a believer, but also to be one that expresses that out. He's writing from Jerusalem because that's where James was headquartered early in that church. Now, some of the special issues, again, is about the Christology of the in James, and the term Lord is interchanged between God and Jesus, and Christ is the Hebrew term that we translate in the Old Testament as Messiah, and he is talking about the coming of the Lord. Now, one of the other issues that comes out is the difference between James and Paul. And James chapter 2, some have interpreted that he is repudiating Paul's doctrine of salvation through faith alone. Now, there's really several ways to look at this. One, that James and Paul disagree and are correcting one another. James is correcting a misunderstanding of Paul, or James and Paul are addressing two completely different issues. Well, I think if we look at this, that both James and Paul are addressing that faith is necessary for salvation. And they're both talking about this issue. They are also talking about that faith without fruit is not salvation, that we ought to show the fruit of our salvation when it comes to our relationship with the Lord. And that when we have faith, that we are accompanied by the fruit. And so I think it's not necessarily a misunderstanding, because Paul hasn't written by then when James writes. I think it's just a misunderstanding of the interpretation of people who think that. Because I think both of them are understanding what's going on. They're just addressing it in different ways. So let me put up the key facts here. This is James, the brother of Jesus. He is writing to Jews, Christians who have been scattered outside of Jerusalem around 45 AD from Jerusalem. And this is a circular letter. It means it would have been passed around to different people. That's why it's not directly to one group when we call it a general epistle. And he's writing to comfort those persecuted believers and to help them to be doers of the faith, to have a full commitment. And then you see the key verse down there in James chapter 2, verses 21 through 22. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Please make sure that even in this, towards the end of the semester, that you are keeping up with all of your assignments and doing all of the required work for this class. I hope everybody has a great day.